title of our next session is Turning the Tables, because it's our turn to quiz a couple of journalists who normally quiz us. And for this session, I'm turning to the World Bank Group's press secretary and spokesman, David Tice. David?
All right, thank you very much, Trevor. Great to see you all today. Thank you so much for tuning in. We're excited to have this session and really excited to have my guests in here today. I've been doing media relations for the bank on and off for a couple of decades, and I'm really happy to have in some folks that I have been working with personally for more years than I'd care to mention. But no, I just want to introduce our panel because I'm very happy to have them. First, we have Heather Scott, who covers us for Agence France Presse, but you first started covering the bank for Market News International, I think, right?
It dates back a little farther than that, actually. A little farther than that. I think, started covering the World Bank, the IMF, back when I was stationed in Venezuela during the Latin American debt crisis.
Wow.
I'm not going to put the year on that because that will date me. But it was a while ago. It was a while
fantastic.
Ago. Yeah.
And Lalit Jha from Press Trust of India. Lalit, you've been covering not just the bank and fund, but virtually everything in Washington that happens for Press Trust of India. Tell us a little bit about your beat and how long you've been on it for the bank and fund.
Yeah, for the bank here in DC, I have been covering it for the last 11 years, but my association means covering bank has been for more than two decades. Mm-hmm. As a cub reporter in Delhi, I was working for the Hindu newspaper. And one of my reporting assignment used to be covering the demonstrations against World Bank in Delhi at its headquarters or in Jantar Mantar over there.
I love it. So one of the challenges is, if you can imagine that you're not covering just, I mean, the beat that covered the bank when I first started doing media relations was just World Bank, IMF, and Treasury. Now you have, in today's world, if you can imagine what was happening in the news today, so many different events. So you are covering now, I mean, I imagine today, we were talking about some of the events today.
Sure, just today. I mean, in the normal course of events, we cover, the U.S. economy and business, right? So that includes the Federal Reserve, which is a big news right now. But just today we had, a huge fine against Facebook. We have an investigation into the major tech companies by the U.S. Justice Department. Massive earnings reports from big American companies, Caterpillar and Boeing, that were really bad, partly because of the trade war.
Right.
We're also covering the trade war. There was news on the trade negotiations with China. So, and that's on top of political news that's going on, although that's outside of our sort of our lane. So it was nonstop writing all day today. Yeah.
And Lalit, I assume that you're covering, in addition, some of the political stuff too. So I can imagine that your day starts pretty early and ends pretty late too, right?
Yeah, it depends on the tweets where it's coming from. It's basically anything about India and Indian Americans, anything of interest to India that's coming from here, from DC. Maybe the White House, the State Department, Pentagon, Congress, obviously the hearing is going on today, and the bank, IMF, all these things. So we have to prioritize every day, which is the most important thing. There have been times when the spring meeting, annual meetings here, when I come here, I'm sitting here inside the World Bank press office, we're writing stories, and suddenly there's some major incidents happening, right? Yeah. So I have to leave those covering the bank and start covering those events happening somewhere else.
It's a little like having a fire hose all the time of news and trying to prioritize that, right?
It's a hub of the news here.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. And as a news consumer, I mean, it seems every year that it comes at you a little faster. Yeah. So what I'm going to do now is, because I get questions from media all the time, I rarely get to ask them questions back. So I'm going to have a little fun here, throw some questions at these guys that'll get incrementally harder and more. No, I'm kidding. But no, so I want to start off with the softest of softball questions, which is simply to ask, what do you think of when you think of the World Bank? And you viewers can sort of have your own answers in your head, but I want to ask the folks here in the room what the first thing you think of when you think of the World Bank is. I'll start immediately with Heather and go to you, Lalit.
Well, of course, it's changed right over all the years we've been covering it. But now it's mostly poverty. It's like dealing with poverty and climate change are the big things that it's associated with. And today, actually, I wrote a story. Another thing we were writing about was Ebola. So also pandemics, health crises, right? Back in the day, it was project finance. It was always the big dam, a road, ports, that sort of thing. So it's really evolved over the decades, right?
Yeah.
My concept of bank has evolved over the years. When I first heard of the bank, World Bank, as a child, I thought, oh, bank, maybe someone is depositing money there, taking out the money over there. But when I started going to college or student's life, then the narrative of the bank was that it is something which is developing projects, but which is not not for the people, it's against the people. Like there's a massive movement going on in India about Narmada Bachao Andolan, about the Sardar Sarovar project, which was about building dams. Millions of funds was being funded by the bank, but there was strong movement against the bank because the project was displacing hundreds and thousands of people.
Global news,
Global news,
absolutely.
So that was the concept when I was in India, right? And when I came here, when I started covering the bank very closely, then I found out that it's also looking at the project which is futuristic in nature. What's happening in the bank today, what bank is thinking today, is going to be implemented by the other countries in the decades and years to come, which is for the benefit of the people over there, like poverty alleviation, climate change issues, which people are not aware of these.
Absolutely. I am covering the bank, and I mean, I deal with this myself because, I mean, here we are in the Econothon, and we're talking to economists, and you have all these economists on. Economists speak a lot of economic mumbo-jumbo, and you have to translate it into articles that your grandmother can understand. Tell us a little bit about the challenges of sort of, you know, dealing with an organization that speaks in paragraphs when you have to write in sentences.
Yeah, that is a perennial challenge, right? And especially when I'm a little bit of a nerd myself, so I speak economist, and I really like that stuff, the topics. So it's hard, to train yourself. You have to make it approachable. You have to make it lively, make it relate to people. Of course, it depends on your audience. Sometimes, if I'm writing for economists, I can keep it a little more nerdy. But the problem too, I think, with the places like the bank, they're looking at macro issues, things in very generalities. They don't get to specifics, and we need to make it specific and make it relatable to a country in particular. So
yeah, the challenge is the playing with the numbers. So how to explain those numbers, those figures, and those papers which have been written in a very academic point of view. It's not their fault, but they have so in tuned into those academic research, and they come out with the paper. And we are writing for general public, right? Where in a country the illiteracy rate is not very high, right? So we have to translate that, transform that into make it understand in their own language, in the simple terms. That's the biggest challenge for us.
Let me dig into that a little bit, Lalit. So when you're interviewing an economist, and I'll come to you with this too, Heather, what's your least favorite and most favorite thing about interviewing economists?
When they start throwing out numbers which I'm not able to, a lot of numbers are starting coming up. So that's a very big challenge, how to simplify those numbers, how to make those numbers understand my audience. And those terms, right, SDG, MDG, all these terms, GDP, even GDP, all these terms, how to help my common masses, people living in a village or small towns, how to help them understand what does this mean for them.
Right.
And the danger is when you boil it down, to the very basics, you sometimes miss the nuance, and it can become more misleading when you try and explain it. So it's super challenging to try and make that the very complex topics that are really very important and explain why it's so important to the people that are reading.
I say this to economists here all the time because you're talking to someone about who's launching a report, and you'll say, look, we need to unpack this, we need to synthesize this, because if you're not helping reporters get it right, you're helping them get it wrong. And it's intellectually far more challenging to actually take a complex idea and make it understandable. That's, people will say you're dumbing me down, and I'm like, no, this is much more intellectually challenging, I agree.
Right, and you have to take a lot of words in your article to explain.
Right.
And then the news, also gets lost in there. So
absolutely.
Yeah, right. By the time we come to the news, by explaining all these things, a lot of space is gone.
Right. Can I ask for examples from you guys of like your worst example of Technospeak, and like, when you had an economist in front of you that, you're sort of, this sounds like English, but I'm not understanding a word of it. Do you have examples? Or when you just get the alphabet soup of acronyms? I mean, is there something that
it's endemic in Washington, D.C., right? We have the alphabet soup. So it's in every single thing that we cover. But I mean, I think the currency, anything that has to do with the currencies, and what is the one, the rear? It's the rear, the REER, like real equilibrium exchange rates.
Oh.
That one is, and the other one I don't like, and maybe just because it sounds weird, is PPIP. I don't like PPIPs. It's public-private investment partnership?
I think
something like that. Anyway, those, they're not helpful.
Any examples of your, sort of the worst?
They could be A to Z of those acronyms. Every time I read a report, there are 4 or 5 such acronyms, which is very difficult for me to understand as a general public, and how to explain them to my audience back home. Yeah.
I mean, we talked about this at the beginning, and I want to go back to it because we're in this world where things are coming at you 24/7, 365. It's just boom, 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 something new. I mean, this is partly a challenge that I'm sort of asking you because I want to know how to break through myself. But I mean, how do you, when there's so much going on and you're trying to cover things that you feel are important to cover, but there's so much to cover, I mean, how do you sort of decide to prioritize? I mean, does your editor give the steer, or are you sometimes able to pick and choose? How do you break through and actually devote the time and attention to some of these issues that they deserve?
Well, it's like you said, right? We always have to pick and choose. We have to prioritize every day because, you know, we just don't have enough bodies and bandwidth to cover it. And the honest answer is the most controversial, sort of biggest thing. So right now, anything dealing with the China trade gets our attention because it's so important for everyone, right? It's so important for all the economies. And things that are kind of problems that have been around for a long time and making incremental change, those get less attention. So a lot of times things like poverty alleviation projects, those get left because it's always going to be there. There's always another story we can write about that. So it's hard to break through, you know, getting those stories that are not big and not big catchy headlines, right?
Yeah, same here. My favorite issue would be poverty alleviation, education, health, climate change. But so many things happening here, you don't get much time to devote your time and energy on those issues. But sometimes when one can do it, I have to isolate myself, focus on that particular issue for a few days, and then write about it.
I call it the cone of silence.
Yeah.
When I'm in the cone of silence, I put my headphones on and no one can talk to me so that I can dedicate to doing another more interesting story, but it's happening more rarely lately because we just have so much going on.
No, I can't imagine, and so I'm going to take advantage of the fact that you guys are here to ask you both something that, you know, I think a lot of people have views of the World Bank and would like to see the bank doing something differently in one area or another, be it in our sectoral work, in our project work, in our policy advice. If you, as reporters, had one bit of advice for the World Bank on what you think we should do to be more successful in engaging with reporters, what would be the piece of advice that you would say, you know, do more of this and less of this? I'll turn to you, Lalit, first.
With the reporters?
Yes, in terms of how we deal with you and how can we make your life better? What could we do better and what could we do worse? Or what are we doing now that we shouldn't be?
Don't tell them any secrets, though, right?
Yeah, engage us more, give us more briefing on issues which is of very concern. Maybe I'm talking about poverty alleviation, climate change. What are the various issues involved here? The developing countries, because I'm writing for those countries. Even for controversial issues like the Indus River, which is between India and Pakistan.
Right.
It will be much better to engage reporters from that region to explain to them how World Bank is involved into it, how much distance World Bank has maintained on that issue, because it's a controversial issue an important issue between India and Pakistan.
And is there anything we're doing right now that drives you nuts, or would you tell me? No, Heather, what about you?
I'll tell you offline.
What do you think?
Honestly, I have to say that there's a little bit of report overload. I think we get overloaded with huge reports.
Yeah.
I kind of think maybe some hot takes would be more effective.
Interesting.
You know, and narrow it down. Instead of having a huge report with lots of boxes, just do a hot take on the box. You know, do that on a particular issue where you can get a little more traction. And it might not get covered, but if you do the whole report, for sure we're not going to cover some of the more interesting aspects. We just don't have the time, right?
No, and this is one of the challenges of the World Bank is that, you know, it's not a bank that works on one issue. We're working one day, we've got a report on poverty. The next day we have, you know, someone wants to launch what is really important work on climate or really important work on infrastructure. And, you know, we face in the press office this challenge of, you know, every Monday I have a meeting where, you know, I get all the communications people from across the bank to essentially just coordinate what I call valet parking. It's trying to get everything parked so you're not denting cars. And I know that some of that is probably frustrating for you because I'll say, no, you can't report put 2 reports out on August 6th, but then the person will say, okay, then I'm going to put mine out on the 7th, thus leaving us with, throwing these things at you guys 2 days in a row, which we try and avoid, obviously,
Sure.
but no, it's a very important issue.
Well, and that's what happens. A lot of those reports have buried in them a special topic. It's super interesting, but I'm never able to write about it because I have to cover the headline part of the report. So,
And
yeah.
so much is going on here. I mean, the World Bank is doing so much work in every field with every countries, right? It's a bit, I think it's a big challenge for you to what to put out what to release to the press.
No, it's extremely difficult. I don't envy you in your work at all, because I feel that you've had this, as we've said, the amount of news is increasing, but so has the size of your beats. I mean, the specialization that used to exist in the media world simply doesn't anymore, and that presents real challenges, because the days of someone who could really dig in to one special topic and become a topic expert is becoming much more challenging.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, look, I'm going to thank you both for coming in. I just really appreciate your taking the time in this crazy news hectic world to to be able to. I was honestly really nervous. I said, after everything that's going on today, I said, are they going to be able to come in? And there was like, Heather got here a minute before you, Lalit, and I was going,
right.
oh no, something happened. He's not going to be able to come. So thank you. I really
Thanks for
appreciate
having
it.
us.
Thank you all for tuning in on this session. The World Bank is always putting news out, which I hope you will follow, but I hope that you just listen to the development issues as well, because it is of key importance, and we're really glad that you're paying attention to it. So Trevor, I think you've got another session coming up, right?
That's right. And thank you, David, for a fascinating discussion. Now, let's take a quick look at the conversation going on out there. And we're back to Econothon, and I'm joined again by Faher. Faher, what have you got for us this hour?
Hi, Trevor. Thank you for having me back. Yeah, it's been really great again, just talking to a lot of different people from all around the world, seeing how engaged all of you have been, again, not just with us, but with one another, so it's been really great. I do want to give a couple of shout outs. Angeline said she cannot wait to the Women Empowerment segment, which will be coming up at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, so in about 40 minutes. So stay tuned if you want to watch that. Thank you, Angeline. We look forward to having you. Kelly from the UK said, I'm interested in your views about environmental and economic impact of climate change. Thank you, Kelly. Hope you watched our earlier segment, and hope you watched some of the later ones as well. Miriam said, I believe impact entrepreneurship in Africa is solution to many challenges that we face. Entrepreneurship has been a trending topic, so tune in and hear what we have to say here during Econothon and on our website. There's a lot of data, a lot of study cases, projects that we talk about, so keep doing that. Hi to Ali Askar from Turkey. Hi, Ali. Thank you for joining us. And then Abdurrahman Abdulaji, he said, he really provided a great comment. He said, good day. Firstly, I'd like to mention that some of us in Africa are a bank of ideas. We definitely agree with that. Everything that we receive, whether from here, whether from on project, are really, really great. And so those are some of the comments that we have. Don't forget hashtag Econothon and tag us at World Bank.
Wow, it's really a lively conversation out there. So it's hashtag Econothon and at World Bank to reach us. We're going to keep it going. So we're going to get back to you later in the next hour.
Be here.
I'm looking forward to that. Anything else we should follow in general about the World Bank and social media?
Yeah, absolutely. If you've noticed, we posted earlier a poll on our site, so you can see it right there. Join that poll. It's talking about what do you think the most challenging development that we have. So if you haven't already voted, please go ahead and do so. We're looking at those responses that we'll be announcing tomorrow. Job creation is still a top choice.
Great.
So we're going to see that.
Great. Awesome job.
Yeah.
Thanks, Faher.
Thank
and we'll
you,
check
Trevor.
in later.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
The World Bank Group works closely with the private sector to achieve its goals of ending poverty. The International Finance Corporation, the IFC, recently launched its impact investing principles. These principles aim to bring greater transparency and accountability to the impact investing market. Here to explain more, we have Neil Gregory, a Chief Thought Leadership Officer with the IFC, and Afsani Beshlas, founder and CEO of the investment management firm Rock Creek. Welcome to you both. So Neil, before we get to the principles, can you explain what is impact investing? What should we know about that sector?
Sure. So I think there's been an explosion of interest in the last few years from investors who say it's not enough for me just to earn a financial return from my investment, and it's not even enough just to avoid doing harm with my investments. I actually want my investments to make a positive contribution to building a better world, whether it's combating climate change or reducing poverty or other social and environmental goals. And so impact investments are investments which both aim to produce a financial return and to have a positive environmental and social contribution.
Excellent. So not just a market return, but a social return as well. Excellent. So Neil, the IFC recently announced the impact investing principles. Can you tell us a little bit more about the content of the principles and the impact that these principles wish to achieve?
So as I say, there's a lot of interest in investing for impact, but investors were telling us that they were confused. There were lots of funds and products to invest in which were labeled impact or sustainable or SDG, and people didn't really know if they put their money into that fund, how exactly it was going to be used and how it would actually contribute to environmental and social impacts. So what the principles do is really lay out the process by which you integrate that consideration of the impact of your investment alongside the consideration of the financial performance of your investment at all stages of the investment life cycle, from designing your investment strategy, choosing what to invest in, to how you screen and select individual investments, to how you manage an investment portfolio, all the way to how you exit from those investments. And these principles together really define how an investment can be managed in a disciplined way so that it actually delivers real impact as well as financial returns.
Excellent. Afsani, I'll turn to you. So why did your firm sign up to the principles?
We have been investing in impact, very broadly defined as Neil described it. And what we realized, both when I was at the World Bank Group and at Carlyle and now at Rock Creek, that there is a huge void in being able to validate your investments and being able to measure particular kinds of impact. And there have been a number of entities that have done a lot of work on trying to define different kinds of impact. At the same time, they were not focused towards the investor community, especially the institutional investor community that likes to invest with the financial return and create long-term value. But how do you measure this value, long-term value creation? And really the work that Neil did and the team at IFC did was unique. And what was very helpful to us, and we were involved in the early stages, and we're very proud to be early signatories, but also as we talk to other investors who are learning about this, it is really a unique way to bring impact into how you look at your total portfolio and how you monitor your portfolio to make sure that you're actually making the impact you intend to.
And how can the impact investment community more broadly impact development or foster achievement in social sustainable development?
I think what the institutional investor community has realized, and the broader investment community, that short-term investing does not really generate the returns, for, even if you're looking at it very, very short-term and very selfishly, that you want in order to meet your long-term goals. There's so much changing. Let's say you might believe in coal being a good fuel or a bad fuel, but if other people believe that it's a stranded asset and you have a large amount of investments in coal, that might not be a good investment. So I think what the investors have realized it is really important to create value in the long term. So whether you're looking from Warren Buffett's long-term value creation, or you're looking from IFC's, or you're looking from a particular Fortune 100 company or a Chinese company, you really need to make sure that you are going to be around in 20 years. You're going to be around in 30, 40, 50 years. And you have to be doing the right products. So if the millennials are not going to be buying your products because you're destroying environment, or you're investing in private prisons, or you're doing things that are not good for the younger population in terms of access to the internet, you're not going to be around.
So thank you, Afsani. Neil, I'm going to turn to you. What does signing up to the principles mean? What does it entail?
So I think the key thing that it involves is being transparent and willing to disclose publicly how you follow the principles in your business. So there are different ways of achieving impact, and different investors have different systems and approaches for how they actually implement their impact investing. What they will now do, Rock Creek and other signatories have agreed that every year they will publish a statement which explains how they are following the principles, which will bring a degree of transparency to the market that's frankly been missing up until today, and I think investors are really hungry for. And secondly, signatories commit to then having an independent verification. So somebody from outside the business, be it an auditor or an independent evaluation committee, come and take a look at what they're doing in their operations and actually provide that independent validation that says, yes, they are actually doing the things that they say. There's a lot of concern about greenwashing and impact washing, and is this just hype and marketing? We think through this transparency and this independent verification, we can give investors the confidence to know that when they put their funds with one of the signatories to the principles, that their funds will really be managed to deliver real impact in a very disciplined way.
Excellent. And Afsani, anything to add? What do the principles mean from your side?
I think what Neil said is really key. Because, again, it's good to say that you have goals to, let's say, improve education for a larger group, or you're improving well-being and health for lower income populations, or providing affordable housing or financial inclusion. I think what has been really, really interesting, given what you're discussing today, since this morning, there's so much that is going on right now in the emerging markets in particular, and development economics. And I think the very exciting thing about what Neil and his colleagues have done is that this is going to be the way that populations are going to invest in development in the future. By investing in financial return, in things that generate financial returns, but also generate long-term development. And therefore, this sort of what Neil just talked about, which is how do you also verify that what you're doing has an impact, is going to be extremely important for the investor community, but also broadly for the people who are choosing to buy the stock in your company, wherever you are, whether you're in Africa or you're in the US or in Europe.
Great. And this is a question to, I guess, both of you. Can you give us an example of a impact investment project that you believe is working?
So I think there are many great examples, and IFC has invested alongside other investors in many very impactful investments. I would particularly note the investments we've made in solar power in Africa in the past few years, alongside many other investors. Africa is really the last continent where many people did not have any access to power at all. And through these investments in solar power, we've been able to bring a scale to power generation that has brought the cost of solar power generation down to very affordable levels, and is really going to provide the basis for real economic transformation in Africa. And for people who want jobs and who want opportunity, they need power. And through investments in solar power, it also has benefits for climate change, and that this doesn't generate any CO2 emissions, but equally importantly, it provides opportunities for people who need power to get jobs and to get economic opportunity.
Great. Afsani, anything to add?
Neil took the example I wanted, so I will use, and I love solar power, and I completely agree with everything Neil said, particularly in larger economies, but also island economies, and we've seen how they get hit by different events, climate-related events, and how it's much better to be using solar power than imported diesel. But the other side, I think, another example that I would use is we've been doing a lot in affordable housing. And it's been really interesting because bringing low income populations housing may not have seemed as one of the highest return areas, but actually a lot of investors across sovereign funds, across DFIs, across US institutional investors are looking at affordable housing because larger numbers of population need to, in terms of financial inclusion, to have housing, and it also is a good investment. So that's another area that has been very interesting.
Great. Neil, I believe you mentioned the reports earlier on an annual basis reporting to the impact principles. Are there any other annual measurements or indicators that we could look to see how the impact investment projects or investor firms are doing?
So I think all of the investors who are following the principles are going to be collecting the data which will measure the impact and be reporting on that. So I think that you'll see that this discipline of following the principles is really going to change the market. But today there's a lot of talk up front about the impact you're trying to have and not enough evidence afterwards of the impact you really have achieved. So what the principles talk about is actually both setting targets in advance, but also tracking and reporting on them afterwards. So I think as more and more investors come on board and continue to join us in signing the principles, you're going to build up this much stronger base of data about what's been achieved. And not only does that then give the confidence to investors to invest more and continue to grow the financing, it also helps increase the evidence base and helps us to learn what investments are working and where we should be investing more to achieve real results.
Great. And Neil, do you see the mix of institutional investors that are investing in IFC projects? Is that changing, or do you seek to change that institutional mix through this initiative?
So over the past few years, we've been raising more capital from pension funds and insurance companies and other institutional investors. I think they see the need to be getting more exposure to emerging markets and also to get more investments into their portfolios which are contributing to addressing climate change and the sustainable development goals. I think for a pension fund, they realize there's not much point just providing a pension in 20 years' time to my pension holder if the world is 2 degrees hotter and it's off track on achieving social goals. And the same for insurance companies. They realize there's no point writing insurance policies if you're then investing the fees and the premiums into things which are actually making the risks that the world faces worse. And so we see this increased appetite from institutional investors. We think as the market provides more products in alignment with the principles, it will give them confidence to put more of their portfolios into impactful investments.
Excellent. And if any firms or individuals, I'd like to ask, maybe start with Afsani, would like to learn more about how they get into impact investment from either as an employee or as a firm or as a project holder, what would you tell them?
I think I would say read, what Neil and his colleagues have been writing on this. I think there's a lot of really great research actually that the IFC has done. We have done a lot of work in this area, but actually one area that is missing as we speak is a very good marketplace or place where you can find information on the different projects you could invest, funds or projects or companies. So apart from the ones that are larger and well known to the larger investors, there's just so much going on right now in the world of impact investing. But some of it is very specific to a local market in, let's say, a particular country in Africa in a particular sector. And let's say if I do work on oceans that is interesting only to 3 investors, and there are 10 other investors out there who are interested, they will have difficulty finding out about it. There's no place that this information is there. So one of the areas that we're working on, we've talked to Neil and others about, is how do we help create this, fill this void so that the investor who's interested in learning more can in fact go to one place and say, okay, this is my area of interest, this is where I can put my money.
Great. Well, with that, I'd like to thank you both. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Afsani.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
And now, on to another hot topic, trade and development. What are the linkages between the two? And how do obstacles to trade affect the world's poorest? To host that conversation, we'll be joined by the World Bank's chief economist, Penelope Goldberg. But first, a short video.
The future is me.
Mwakache nyaseyo
nze biseera by'omu maaso
na me be the future.
Bini Machino.
nele sinyasiriye
Le futur, c'est moi, Michi Wase.
dinira mangwana
Isau Nuwavi.
narine hubom the future is me.
I'm Penny Goldberg, the World Bank Group's chief economist. And in this segment, we're going to discuss the upcoming World Development Report, which is going to be on trade and development. Specifically, the title of the report is Trading for Development in the Age of Global Value Chain. So I'm here with two of the directors of the report, Caroline Freund and Aditya Mathu, to discuss the findings of the report. So let me start with a very basic question. The report is on trade, as I said, but specifically on global value chains. So Caroline, could you please explain for your audience in non-technical terms, what are global value chains and why has the World Bank decided to focus on global value chains this year?
So global value chains describe trade that crosses borders more than once. So it might be raw material that is exported and goes to another country, gets processed in some way into another part and component. Maybe it crosses another border and gets put into a final good, and then finally goes somewhere for consumption. So all this is happening, and trade is continuing through each border. And what's really interesting is this increased a lot, this type of trade, from about 1990 to the mid-2000s. And as a result, there was just this boom in trade that helped countries to grow. And there are two things about global value chains that are really special. One is hyper-specialization. So countries don't need to produce a whole good, they just produce one part of a good. And that enables them to trade more because they can take advantage of their comparative advantage in producing this part or component at scale. And the second feature that's interesting is firm-to-firm relationships. So because there tends to be a lead firm involved in these global value chains, and that firm may have special knowledge or technology, and it transfers that to the suppliers. So there tend to be more gains from technology transfer, learning by doing, and so forth. So global value chains help countries to trade, and in some ways make it easier because of this hyper-specialization. And in addition to that, there's this technological transfer part of it that is good for countries.
Mm-hmm. So from what you said, this is a special kind, a specific kind of trade. What do you find in the report? So our ultimate objective in the World Bank is to reduce poverty. So do the global value chains, does trade through global value chains contribute to reductions in poverty, to growth? What are the report's findings?
I think one of the most compelling pieces of evidence in the report is how much participation in global value chains contributes to growth. I think, as Caroline described, first of all, because you break up these complex products like cars and computers into similar parts, it's easier in principle for countries to break in. Secondly, this hyper-specialization is like Adam Smith on steroids. You know, this ballpoint pen, for example, this point is made in Japan, the clip is made in Malaysia, and the body in China. So the scope, as Caroline very nicely said, for specialization, increasing returns to scale, and then flows of technology, capital, and inputs, that really boosts productivity. We found, for example, in Ethiopia, that firms that are participating in global value chains are twice as productive as those that aren't really doing similar trade. And countries that have successfully engaged might have grown up to a percentage point faster than other countries. And the biggest boost seems to come when you move from commodity or natural resource or agricultural production into manufacturing. And we saw that in Bangladesh, we've seen it in Cambodia and in Vietnam. So that's the first big boost, the growth boost. The employment story is a little bit more complicated because these global value chains, because the firms are more productive, they also tend to be more capital intensive. So that has created a legitimate worry about whether they're generating enough jobs. But the good news is the higher productivity, the larger scale means, again, in a country like Ethiopia, the firms that are in GVCs, employment is growing much faster than in other. So when you take the higher productivity, the greater employment, that brings only good news for poverty reduction. We've looked across regions in Mexico and Vietnam that the regions where there is greater intensity of GVC participation have seen much sharper reductions in poverty.
So that all sounds very positive. It sounds good news. How about the effects on inequality? So these days, at least in advanced economies, there is a lot of concern that the gains from globalization have not been shared equally. What does the report have to say about this question? Or is that something you are looking at?
There's the rub, as Hamlet would say. I think you're absolutely right, Penny, that there is a concern that while we're getting all these benefits, the world is becoming a more unequal place. We have evidence, for example, which looks at markups, how much firms charge in terms of prices above costs. And these industrial country firms that are outsourcing to developing countries, their markups seem to be increasing, which means they're not passing on the benefits fully to consumers. And developing country firms which are selling to these industrial country firms, their markups seem to be declining. We have a very interesting chart which looks at the garment industry in India and the United States, where you have this contrasting picture. So that's the first problem. The first concern is this international inequality. Then within countries, the fact of outsourcing, for example, from industrial countries to countries with cheaper labor has certainly put pressure on the distribution between capital and labor. The share of capital is increasing, the share of labor is declining. Within the labor market, skill premiums are going up. And there's also a really interesting fact that while women have benefited enormously, like in Bangladesh, in the garment industry, they have really benefited in terms of employment, the glass ceiling that the both of you have broken out of, unfortunately persists in global value chain. So there are legitimate concerns about the world perhaps becoming richer, but more unequal.
So since we're talking about concerns, let me raise another concern that you sometimes hear. So the buy local movement emphasizes that trade can have adverse effects on the environment. And this concern seems particularly pronounced in the case of global value chains, because as Caroline pointed out, the goods cross the border multiple times. So this sounds to me like a lot of transport, a lot of shipping, a lot of packaging. Does the report look at this question?
Yes, we do. We delve into the effects on the environment, and actually they go both ways. So first, if you just think about trade in general, trade enables countries to take advantage of their abundant resources and import scarce resources from abroad. So if you think of an arid country that if it didn't trade, it would have to produce its own food, it's much better to import it and save those very scarce resources. So there's this first general effect of trade, and in GVCs it's even more pronounced, that enables countries to save their scarce resources, which is good for the environment. On the other hand, you do have this back and forth shipping, and that's of concern to some, especially because shipping fuels tend to be exceptionally polluting. And also, we hear often about the plastic wastes in the ocean and so forth, and really 20% of that comes from the shipping industry itself. So there's this aspect of it, as well as the packaging on the materials that need to be shipped back and forth, that tends to be bad for the environment. Hyper-specialization can also result in some damage if you're using a resource too intensively. What we come out thinking about this really is it's very important to price things right. So whether it's shipping fuel, in terms of production, it's important not to subsidize, because if you subsidize different parts, you'll tend to overuse. So the first important rule is really to get prices right, to take into account not just the economic cost, but also the social or environmental costs. Regulations can also help. So to regulate some of the more damaging, whether it's pollution or other effects. Finally, one of the things people worry most about with respect to the environment has been this sort of pollution haven hypothesis that production will move to parts of the world where they regulate the least. Fortunately, that has not turned out to be the case. Comparative advantage is very important, and tends to rule where things move much more than this one small aspect.
So let me ask you a somewhat different question. So far we refer to the past, to the historical experience with global value chains. But looking into the future, one concern many people have expressed is that new technologies, and automation in particular, may limit the scope of specialization, and developing countries may have lost the ability to participate in trade and use trade as a path to develop. Do you have anything to say about this in the report? Of course, I understand it's very hard to look into the future. No one has a crystal ball. But do you have any insights into how technology may affect global value chains?
Well, we can do that looking at the history. So while we don't have a crystal ball, wish we did, what we can do is say, okay, what industries have automated the most and how has that affected trade? And actually what we find is that the industries that have automated the most, such as autos, are also the industries that use global value chains most intensively.
How do you explain that? This seems very counterintuitive. What is the intuition?
Well, when you automate, productivity rises. And this means that either the quality of the good is much better or the price has fallen, so there's more demand. Scale goes up, and as a result of this rising scale, you also need more of these goods that the automation only helps part of production. It doesn't help the whole thing. So for example, in the auto industry, automation is done in the first stage of printing out the big parts. but it's not done in the assembly stage. That's still done by hand. There are certain parts that are still produced largely by people, and we need more of those parts, and those tend to be produced in other countries. So this effect of scale tends to outweigh the labor-saving component, and trade actually increases. So if you look across the goods from least automated to most automated, it's actually the most automated ones that are more intensive in GVC production. We also looked at 3D printing, and there are some goods that are already being 3D printed. And this, everybody thought 3D printers would come into the house and, people be producing their own goods. It's much more complex than that. And it turns out that goods that are being 3D printed, again, you have this productivity saving, and again, they're traded more.
So it seems overall global value chains have beneficial effects on growth and poverty reduction. However, not all countries seem to have participated, or so many people think of global value chains as being prevalent in East Asia or Europe. We don't think of global value chains as being present in Africa or Latin America. Let me ask you, is that true? And if so, what really drives this pattern? What do you have to say about it?
So I think it's absolutely true that when you look at the pattern, it's mostly concentrated in these three: Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and North America. And the question is why? So clearly, geography plays a role. But I think the main drivers have been, at this stage, for example, openness. These are the parts of the world which are relatively open. They have reduced.
Sorry, I did get to interrupt. So by geography, you mean being close to big markets?
Exactly right. I should have said that these are, whether it was close to, in Southeast Asia, to Japan and China, whether it is proximity to Western Europe, the large market for Eastern Europe, or whether it's close to the North American market for Mexico and Central America. I think that has played an important role, but it wasn't just that they were close. These parts of the world also enacted big openness initiatives. The European integration, for example, the NAFTA agreement, and the Southeast Asian countries have traditionally been really open. So in a way, in this world of global value chains where, as Caroline described, goods go back and forth across borders, protection is really costly. It cascades. So eliminating those costs has really helped. The other big thing is connectivity. We've noticed that it's the parts of the world that are really well connected, both in terms of transport and communication, for example, which have implemented relatively seamless liberalization of road, maritime, and air transport, liberalized telecommunications. That has mattered. It's what Richard Baldwin has argued in his book, The Second Great Unbundling, that it's primarily the parts which have been able to create this seamless connectivity that have benefited from this. Finally, just two other points. Endowments matter. Having in that first stage low-cost labor is a huge temptation for investors. And that's the quid pro quo. Foreign investment flows have really facilitated. They have been a powerful driver of global value chain participation, and most of these parts of the world have been relatively open. It's German investment in Polish car industry, and Japanese and Korean investment in Vietnam, and American investment in Mexico that has really provided a powerful kick to this international fragmentation of production.
One takeaway from what you said is that ultimately policy matters, and the kind of policies you mentioned are primarily national policies. What's the role of international cooperation in this environment? So it seems to me, if you have products crossing borders multiple times, we need governments across borders to cooperate. Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely, Penny. The international trading system, the rule-based system has created openness, predictability, which has been a powerful stimulus for the formation of global value chains and has been enormously beneficial for developing countries. They have, as I mentioned, the conclusion of the Uruguay round, but there are also agreements like NAFTA. the accession of China and Vietnam to the World Trade Organization, the accession of the Eastern European countries to the European Union. I think all these international cooperative arrangements have been vital. And there is a real risk now that that whole fabric, which has created low protection, predictable policies, is under pressure now.
Although, so that's a very good point, that the multilateral system is under pressure right now, and there are some people who argue it's gone too far, but there are also other people who argue it hasn't gone far enough, and perhaps liberalization or cooperation should also include other areas going beyond trade. What does the report have to say about this? Do you think international cooperation would be sufficient for global value chains, or do we need to do more?
I think, Penny, we need to walk on two legs, as Mao would say. First of all, we need, to say that we've gone too far. I think in many traditional areas, we still haven't got far enough. There are still high tariffs in developing countries in Africa, in South Asia, which inhibit their own opportunities. Services is vital for connectivity, and again, services markets tend to be heavily protected. Even in Southeast Asia, it's a big irony. They benefited enormously from openness in goods, but continue to protect services. Then state-owned enterprises. There's no doubt that they distort markets. And also, increasingly, since the financial crisis, the World Trade Organization has been tracking a growth in traditional protection. So I think we shouldn't be complacent about the traditional areas. But you're absolutely right. I think one of the most interesting things about global value chains is we need to look beyond trade to keep trade open and beneficial. For example, the distributional concerns, we talked about inequality. We need more cooperation in taxes and taxation so that states can mobilize the resources to help the losers, but also improve infrastructure to create the winners. We need to think about international cooperation on data flows, which are really at the lifeblood of this global value chains. And there are legitimate concerns about privacy. And there are initiatives to address it, but they are at risk leaving developing countries out. And finally, even competition policy. I mentioned markups, unequal benefits. We need greater cooperation because in all these areas, production is globalized, regulation is national, and that mismatch needs to be remedied.
So this is a very interesting point, and I'm afraid we'll have to stop here because we are out of time. But I hope that our conversation gave everyone food for thought. I hope you will go to our website and read more about the upcoming World Development Report. Back to you, Trevor, now.
Thanks, Penelope. That's it for this hour of Econothon. But stay tuned. Danny Clark is here with the next hour of a live broadcast.
Yes, we have 3 big topics coming up. We have women's empowerment, measuring poverty, and the state of our oceans, the blue economy. So I'm very excited for the next hour that I'll be hosting.
Well, I wish you the best in the next hour. I've learned so much in the last hour, from data to trade to impact investing. It's really been a whirlwind tour.